Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl, and my guest today at University Bookstore is a man with too many titles to say before his name, but I will say that he is the author of a new book called Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News. Kevin Young. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So among your other titles are, you are the new poetry editor of The New Yorker.
It's true.
And you're the head of the Schomburg Center, which is the African American library and archive?
Yeah, it's an archive, a cultural center. It's part of the New York Public Library, and it's been there since 1925 in Harlem. So we have over 10 million items related to the global Black experience, from culture to history to everything you can think of, and we've really been holding that torch for a long time and bearing that torch, I should say.
Yes. Was that something that you wanted to do? I mean, did you say? I mean, I think we all know how important that is, and that the Schomburg Center is. But what did you say when you were a little boy and somebody said, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I actually got into libraries, at Emory. I had always worked in them in the archives for books I was doing, either anthologies or critical books or even poems. And then when I was a collector, really as a way of getting at that history and understanding it. And then when I got to Emory University, 2005, I started working in the library as a curator, and it really became a passion for me. And so it's really been a nice step to see libraries from the inside and then to be a director of one.
It must be awe-inspiring to be in that library and see what's been collected there.
Yeah, I mean, we've been really fortunate this year. We've added James Baldwin's papers. We've added the papers of the jazz musician Sonny Rollins. We have some exciting new things I can't wait to announce. And we're really thinking about bringing the sons and daughters of Harlem home and focusing on the way that Harlem is a cultural capital of the Black experience, not just the African American one, but globally. It's a crossroads for many people and has been for 100 years. And so for us to have been there nearly that long and to have traced that is really special, and it is an honor to be there.
And it seems as though a place like the Schomburg Center increases in importance in our culture as the years go by.
Yeah, I mean, I think that archives are more important than ever, and in many ways, a lot of the work that I did for Bunk came out of archives. I was able to sort of create my own sort of hoax library, which was really helpful, and because I really wanted to see these hoaxes up close. You often hear about them, but a lot of the books are pulped or pulled off the shelves or hard to find. And so to go to the originals was really helpful for me. But then there was also just the research that I think an archive can provide. It brings history to life, and a lot of that was really great. And there's a lot of notes here because I really you can't write a book about fakery and not source it well, and a lot of that happened in the library. And that was really essential to working on this book.
Two things I just want to say quickly. One is that more librarians than ever are going into archives. When you talk to somebody who's going to library school, so many of them these days will say archives.
Yeah.
And I think growing out of that same kind of desire to save the documents of the past for the use of those who come after.
Yeah, and being a curator for years and now a director, your goal is to interpret, but also just preserve and promote and collect, and you almost leave it to other people to interpret, and that's sort of what I did in Bunk is play both roles. I was sort of curating this library of hoaxes and then thinking about what do they all mean, and I felt like a lot of what I read about hoaxes seemed really shallow or sort of saying, oh, they're about the thin line between fact and fiction. Which isn't true. There isn't really a thin line. There's a clear, bright one. Yeah, and most people know when they cross it, and I think so do these hoaxers. And also, it seemed to me the hoax was about something more deep and powerful about American life.
Uh-huh. Well, when you're, this is a kind of technical question about
Sure.
your role as at the Schomburg Center. So the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas is another fabulous archive of stuff. Do you like go into things saying, well, this should be ours, that should be theirs, or
I mean,
or
I
is
think
it not as
it's much
personal
more
as that?
organic than that. I mean, I think I try to describe it as falling in love. You know, it's not so much, it has to be the right fit. So it's not like just because you have a good archive that it's good for every one of the people who might be interested in it. Some of it is timing, some of it is what else people are collecting. And really, I think in our case, we have such a broad view that we are good for a lot of things. So I would like to see us even more active. But I also think that Baldwin, to me, is a perfect example of something. He grew up in Harlem. You know, he's from there. He and Sonny Rollins had spent time at the library and up there. And so to have them come back and close that circle has been really special.
I love that, what you said earlier about bringing the sons and daughters of Harlem back home. I think that's a wonderful description. When I was thinking of how to introduce you, one of the descriptors that I thought of using was public intellectual. Is that would you have like made a face internally or not? External?
No. I mean, I think poets are public intellectuals, or can be. You know, and coming from a poetry background, to me, the public part of poetry is always really interesting too, in the ways that when you're advocating for, say, a poem, you're also advocating for poetry, not just your own, but poetry, big P poetry. And I feel that way about thinking about the world of ideas. You know, we need ideas more than ever, and I think poets and some of the writers around us are really poised to make that happen. And you know, I've liked writing about these things that I think are at the center of the conversation, and it's been fortunate. I started this book 6 years ago, and thinking about fakery, and now to have it sort of front and center and in every tweet day that exists. You know, so it was kind of a hunch for me, and then to follow that up and have that come true, as it were, it's been really fascinating. And if that is part of being a public intellectual, then yes, it's good to say.
Well, it's wonderful to have a platform that you can bring these ideas forward. I was thinking when I was reading the book that it must have almost felt like in Alice in Wonderland when she's running to catch up, that something is always a little bit ahead of where you are, some new,
I mean, in a
what
weird
fresh
way.
hell is this?
Yes, well, there was that. I mean, there was a moment when I realized I had to stop because there was always going to be another hoax. But at the same time, it was almost the opposite. I was really saying in drafts, you know, years ago, like, hey, we're in this particular moment where hoaxes are more and they seem worse, and why is that? And I sought to try to understand that. And I feel like it's been proven true. And so it was more like when things started happening, I would just literally add a sentence, you know, just like I sort of thought or had seen before, you know, and I think that's what's really fascinating, is if you're thinking about culture in ways that, you know, I would argue that poets do a lot. You know, we often are the ones talking about some idea, whether it's modernism or the blues, say with Langston Hughes, or, you know, how do we sort of are framing these ideas in ways that are, I think, tapping into culture at its most originating place. And so for me, an essay does that in a different way, or nonfiction, I think, which is most of what I read, does it in a fascinating way. And you can go into a deep dive about these people who have influenced our thoughts and our processes, but we don't necessarily always think about them. And that's what I think cultural history and cultural study can do for us, is reframe how we're thinking. And if my book helps people think about the hoax in a more complicated way, I'd really be grateful to that.
When you were collecting your library of hoaxes, I mean, was it a question of stumbling on them, or I mean, how did this start? How did it all begin, Kevin?
Well, when I was a child, no, I mean, for me, I did work with a hoaxer, which I talk about in the book, when I was in college, and he went on to do sort of national hoaxes that he became somewhat infamous for. And so that was, I think, some early primer on what it means to feel hoaxed, which I think is important to understanding the hoax. Because sometimes we talk about sort of what they did as a kind of clever thing, and then we don't talk enough about the effect it had on the people around them. And that was one of my sort of entry points. But also there was a quality of just the con man, the con artist as this figure in American life, and trying to understand that. And, you know, I started to realize that I had been kind of working toward this book, collecting these little stories and anecdotes, and some of them humorous, some of them less so. And then I said, well, what are they about? And sitting down to try to write about them was how it started. And like I said, it was about 6 years ago.
And so many of the hoaxes, not all, but many of the hoaxes have to do with race. And why, what's your thinking about the reasons for that? Or
I don't think it's an accident that the invention of the word hoax, and we've had obviously fakery for generations and centuries, but the hoax as a word and the modern sense of race come about in the same time, sort of in the middle of the 18th century. And in American life, where I think the hoax plays a role, and sort of one of my questions is the hoax American? Is there something American about it? I think that the hoax provided often a way to think about history. When P.T. Barnum showed Joyce Heth, the woman who he said was George Washington's nursemaid, and that advertised as being 161 years old, you know, he was thinking, I think, or tapping into at least, our sense of history as a new nation and wanting to establish sort of a connection to the past. And I think as the century goes on, one of the things that I realized is the ideas of race, which were kind of inchoate and you know, not so strict, even though they were hierarchical, they weren't quite as hierarchical, and they get worse as the century progresses. Progressing maybe being the wrong word. And I think that the hoax, I realize, plays so often on race because it often is playing on these deep divisions between us, making use of them almost as a shorthand. Oh, here, I'm the very idea, miscegenation, for instance, originates from a hoax. And so let's prey on that and use it sort of politically or not politically, but I start to think, well, maybe all of these things are political. And then as they go on, I think it just becomes almost both habit and kind of a shorthand to turn to race as a way of describing the person that's being made up, or also the person that the person is pretending to be. There's a lot of fake Native Americans in the book, for instance. And you know, I start to try to think about, well, it isn't just that they're pretending to be something they're not, it's what exactly they're pretending to be. And in the case of fake Native folk, they often are pretending to be sort of tragic and near extinct. There's this kind of real desire not to be a kind of movie Indian, as it were. And I think that's really troubling in the end, because it starts to affect how we view real people.
And how we may be grown not to trust people because of that very real possibility. I mean,
well, I don't know if it's a real possibility or if it requires of us being a bit more careful about, and maybe we're saying the same thing, about how we think about each other. You know, I think we have a responsibility to listen, but we also have a responsibility to question and be part of a conversation. And if you sort of exclude all Native American voices and then only listen to the fake ones, then you start to be troubled even more, I think, by how the conversation happens.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking one of the hoaxes that I think a lot of people might, because it was all over the news, certain parts of the news, was the Clark Rockefeller hoax.
Yeah, fascinating.
And you know, where, I mean, he fooled everybody.
On very slim evidence. He'd wear like a Yale cap, and people like, oh, you can buy those. But people would be like, oh, he was
cheaper than going to Yale.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, there were a lot of kind of assumptions that he played on, and a lot of them did have to do with race, with ideas of class. You know, he could
Right.
be as eccentric as possible because people thought he was
Right.
wealthy, and all he needed was a name. And not even if you hear his accent, it doesn't sound like a, you know, Boston accent, though that's
Right.
not even where the Rockefellers are from. You know, it becomes this real stretch afterwards, you know, and you start to see the ways that after a hoax is exposed, we get to see not just what is true, because of course they're not true, but what people truly believe and what they're willing to invest in. And it becomes really, brings you up short sometimes when you see how little it takes for someone to be believed as native or
Right.
Clark Rockefeller,
Right.
or if you're Rachel Dolezal as
yeah,
black.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or growing up in a terrible family and
Mm-hmm.
suffering, as in, you know, in James Fry,
Yeah.
Fry's case, that kind of
Well,
thing.
and I think that's the thing that's happened, I think, is the hoax has changed. You know, the hoax used to be, in, say, Barnum's day, a bit of an honorific, even if there were a lot of problems and troubling aspects of showing Joyce Heth, the woman he claimed was Washington's nursemaid. At least there was a kind of, you know, wish to honor some sort of tradition. And now you see a real horror being trotted out, what I call plagiarizing pain, you know.
Yes.
And that kind of idea of not just, that's the only thing that sort of speaks to us in some ways and cuts through. And we've reduced the notion of the self to autobiography, when there is this really interesting, broad self out there that we should, you know, maybe embrace.
But in some ways, aren't we all hoaxers, in the sense of that sort of plagiarizing ourselves in a way?
Well, I mean, I say at one point, you know, literature plagiarizes life. You know, I mean, there is a way in which our art is made up of our life, even if it's not autobiographical. But I think that the danger becomes kind of two things. One is to the idea of truth, and the hoax kind of threatens that. And so we start to argue over the truth when, you know, there are facts that can be proven and shown and, you know, not argued over again. The world is round.
Right, right. And the sun rises in the east.
Right. So, but then the second part is that I think it also threatens art, you know, and that's the part that I came to understand, is the ways that the hoax really isn't a case of wild imagination. It's the opposite. It's really often quite small in its thinking and not as broad as ourselves are, you know, and that's why it can become super troubling afterwards. And I think that the idea of the imagination is really one that needs restoring. And I think in some way, though it would seem like hoaxes honor imagination, they're really not that imaginative once I started tracing them across time. I mean, I think Barnum was very clever. Don't get me wrong. I think there's enjoyable aspects and powerful, entertaining aspects of the hoax. I wouldn't have written a whole book if it was just like, here, you know, scolding them. But, and I think that some of that pleasure comes across, I hope. But I also think we have to think about the way that the imagination joins us, you know, and lets us sort of imagine how other people are living and how they can be, rather than accepting a kind of plagiarized version of that.
Right. Was there a hoax that you were particularly appalled or disgusted by, or that,
I mean, there's some strange ones for sure. There's one by a woman named Marlo Morgan, who she's admitted before and then sometimes does it, where she claimed to go on walkabout with Aborigine peoples, and that they were telepathic and didn't need to eat. I mean, things that sort of turned them from people to, and they were called the real people, which is, I think, an amazing kind of.
Right, I remember that book.
And it sold, you know, millions and millions of copies, you know, and it affects how we think about. And it's a very particularized kind of tradition of pretend fake Aborigine people. And I trace that in the book. And it's also oddly American. You know, that book didn't sell well in Australia, where people I know some folks who aren't so telepathic. But at the same time, you know, what does it say to us about race and displacement and fear and trauma?
It must have been, I would think, I wonder if it was as both exhilarating and frustrating and angry making, in a way, writing the book?
There are definitely people I wanted to have some arguments with or sit downs with, but I feel like what happened though is I really came to understand not just why people deceive, but why we believe,
Well,
and try to understand
right.
our complicity or our collusion or our, collaborating in a, benign and also
Right.
terrible way with the hoax.
What is the need within us that drives us to believe something that, on the face of it, could not be true? That this woman is 161 years old and Barnum is displaying her. I mean, what does that say?
Right.
I mean, maybe that has an easier explanation because it is a connection to a past that many of the people looking at her, their great-grandparents, and the story's passed down. But
well, there's a kind of, any Antique Roadshow has examples of family lore. Right. So there is a kind of that part of it. But I also think there's a deeper need that we have, both to believe and to trust. But also what I think troubles me about the current hoax, the modern hoax, the contemporary one, is that it preys on sort of our worst fears about each other. Right. So it isn't simply that, oh, gee, I want to connect. It's also like, well, these folks over here on the other side of the mountain are, as bad as you fear. Right. And it goes from the woman, Margaret Seltzer, who pretended to be a South Central gang member, which when you hear her talk, which I had never heard, but recently someone played me the radio clip. I was like, I can't believe anyone ever believed it, because I remember vividly hearing it at the time, and luckily I was like, that sounds really corny to me. Really rehash of kind of every cliche from every bad 90s movie, and sure enough, it came true that it was fake. And that's one of those, I remember that was probably one of the first books I got. And that's a funny story because I realized it, and then the next day I was like, wait, it just came out and it's going to be taken away. So I called up my local bookstore and I said, do you have a copy? And they said, yes, but I'm returning it at 6 o'clock. And it was like 5:35, and I hopped in the car and ran over, and I said, I want two. And he said, it's fake, right? I said, yes, that's exactly why I want it. And reading it, it's even more troubling and filled with sort of really stereotypical dialogue and things that afterwards look pretty obvious.
It's just amazing to me, the situation that we're in 2017, almost 2018, where it's like we're living in a hoax. I mean, that we've been hoaxed by everything that we thought was real.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, Twitter can get pretty tough sometimes because there's a lot of easy responses, and I think it's tempting to blame the internet sometimes, but I really think we made the internet, and the internet is also the place where a lot of these internet hoaxes, for instance, are found out. Right. Stephen Glass, who hoaxed so much at the New Republic's over 45 or 50 stories, he was caught because he wrote a fake internet story, and a smart reporter tracked it down and said, this is not true, couldn't find, the company he made up that was supposed to be a, gazillion-dollar company, and things like that I think really speak to it. But it also tells us, those were almost warnings all along the way, right, of what I call sort of the age of euphemism. And I think we're in the thick of it. We're in the thick of not saying what we mean. Right. Politicians do this, and I think also there's a quality of sort of everyday life that somehow saying the truth is rude or something. And this is just sort of what I've come to see in intervening months. That said, telling the truth, I think, is a good part of what we need to do and how we honor each other. Yes. And so that's where I'm at. And you see it in other ways where the truth is being told, I think, about sexual harassment, and you're seeing the ramifications of people getting to the truth and telling us what we should have known was happening, and many of us did know, and so clearing the decks, I think, is important.
I have a question about the internet, just because you're such a reader and a poet and think about words and love words. And I find that having been addicted to the internet, to Twitter especially, as I am, my social media of choice, is that it has become harder and harder to sit down and get engrossed in a long form piece. Have you found that or not?
I'm not sure. I mean, I wrote a long form piece.
You
so
did, and,
so
and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I feel like it required that, and so
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I do think Twitter has changed some, and it's probably changed us in ways we don't totally know. But I think that there's a lot of people really almost craving more. I mean, I see that with poems. People want more than 140 or 280 characters. I see that when people come up to me or talk about the poems I pick for the New Yorker, and the poems that appear there. And the pages, I think, speak to people in ways that I think Twitter can, send those around in a way that's really powerful. So I hate to kill the messenger. Because the message has gotten often really filled with some of the same kinds of troubling. Or I almost think the internet can feel like a hoaxy place sometimes.
I think
filled with dead ends and false starts. But it's all the more reason to think about the ways that Bunk fills our lives and be sort of vigilant about that.
Yeah, and I think too that it's a reason to go back and read poetry, which I don't think that you can hoax somebody in poetry.
Well, there are hoax poems and poetry hoaxes, but that might be for another day.
Yeah, yes, well, that's true, but still, Emily Dickinson, hoaxes of Emily Dickinson.
Well, yes. What's interesting, I think, is once the hoax is stripped away, a lot of these other forms, nonfiction or a supposed memoir, it doesn't really, isn't as effective. But some of those poems, like by the poet Ern Malley, which is an Australian hoax, they're great, and you still have the poems. They have to rest on that.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting aspect of it.
Well, I have one last question, which is you're on this book tour to talk about Bunk. So what have you taken along to read? My last question.
Oh, I'm reading Jill Lepore's book on Wonder Woman and the secret history of Wonder Woman, which is fascinating. And also, I love these kinds of histories that think about work and the real story behind something, and that's very much what I was trying to do with Bunk.
Well, congratulations. It's a wonderful, fascinating book. And
Thank you.
There's something to think about and consider and roll around in your mind on every page. So we really needed a book like this at this time. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.